really excited to be actually having this panel. I'll do it a little bit later because I want to really focus on the startups, the wonderful startups that we have here. But we also went through, a wonderful pivot that was pretty interesting. But I think what's really nice to see is I would love to hear from everyone on the panel, just maybe a little bit about yourselves, giving your names, the companies that you've created, and how it really started, where the first process, the first really logic, the first really thoughts that were going about happening to where you are now, where you've created more of a change in the business and what that's really done. So maybe what we could do is, if anybody wants to start out, thinking maybe Michelle, Matt, Rathi, you want to start out with a little bit about that?
Sure, I can go first. So Michelle Carrazas, hello everyone. Pleasure to not really see, but virtually see everyone. So I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Host Events. We started the business specifically targeting a way to build community culture, communities within culture at corporate events. And so we did that through social experiences. And prior to COVID, that was in-office mixology classes, in-office cocktail hours. And so we would bring certified and insured bartenders to corporate settings to help create that kind of fun and elevated experience. Now, we're obviously doing things a little bit different, all virtual, of course, but it's allowed us to actually think different, expand our reach, and provide services that we never thought we could. So excited to be here.
That's awesome. Maybe Matt, you want to tell us a little bit about yours?
Sure. Matt Keeman. So I helped start a company called Jevit out of a Boston College dorm room many years ago. We are a declared data company. Declared data is essentially an explicit piece of information that you give a brand. So you can think of what we build as fancy surveys that don't necessarily feel like surveys, where you come to an engaging experience, you can share a piece of information with a brand in a very explicit manner, and you can feel a little bit more assured that the brand will use that information to help cater further communication in a more personalized way. So the aim is to basically get rid of assumptions and like creepy information gathering techniques from the marketing world. As I said, it was started in a Boston College dorm room, and it started more as like it was like a marketplace specifically for college students where they could earn small amounts of money for answering questions for a brand. So it was a little bit more transactional. We'll get into why we pivoted in a little bit.
Okay, awesome. And then to end it off, Rathi.
Hi, I'm Rathi. I'm the co-founder and the CTO of a consumer hardware company called Droplet in downtown Boston. Our core technology is it's a handheld drug delivery device that can deliver molecules significantly deeper into the skin by creating an enhanced aerosol. So it's compatible with a wide range of formulations and molecules, and it's really a platform technology. My co-founder and I actually spun Droplet out of a previous venture we were working on called Novopixes, which you might also have seen on the write-up for the seminar. And Novopixes was actually a drug company. We developed a drug for pediatric cardiomyopathy that got the first FDA designation for an orphan drug since the early 90s, which was really exciting. But Droplet actually started as a side project within Novopixes. And once we filed a patent on it and we got the patent granted, we spun it out into a separate company. And, it's come a long way in that we started really intending to go first into the medical device sphere, and we're actually launching in the consumer space in a few weeks. So happy to chat about that throughout this panel.
I mean, just to kind of continue with that piece, moving from more the medical devices where there's lots of, I guess, the FDA requirements, it's more challenging. There's a more longer life cycle to kind of get it into the hands of the market. How did it switch over to more consumer? What kind of products are you using, or what kind of illnesses are you using to use your product now?
Yeah, so the thing about skin delivery is that we actually developed the technology to address a rare disease called EB, epidermolysis bullosa, which is a really painful rare genetic disorder. But it turns out that, like you said, the FDA is a pretty big hurdle to getting a product to market. And we realized that there's a huge opportunity in consumer skincare where, we can use products that can, because really the problem in skincare is that 90% of what you put on your skin never gets in. The molecules are too large, or like lotions and creams, they get wiped or sweated away before anything can ever happen. So really we wanted to fix that problem and actually deliver actives, because actives themselves are known to work, but they're not delivered effectively in the form of like creams and lotions. So there's a huge opportunity to really increase delivery efficacy. So we're using ingredients that are like already known and known to work. And we're initially going into the consumer sphere just because of the fact that we don't have the regulatory hurdle. But the idea is for us to eventually pursue the medical applications in parallel, since the FDA process takes much longer for those.
Nice. That's awesome. And I think that's like, I think we're going to get into a little bit more about that because I have a lot of questions to ask you at that. But that's really, I think, the one thing I heard about that piece of the pivot was created kind of, if you see the regulations, there's maybe it's a financial thing, maybe it's about the opportunity that's currently being had. But I think that's what's wonderful about seeing the different pivots or the different things that kind of click into play that allow you to even switch from your goal, your overall goal for a second, and then kind of switch back. But just having that understanding, I think that's what's wonderful about startup community, being able to have that thought about maybe I should try something out and then I can get back to it. So that kind of leads me into maybe Michelle, maybe you could tell me a little more about what was the cause of the pivot? What did it feel like? Maybe what was the sentiment of the team? I'm not sure if you're only working with just yourself or if you have a team. Like how did that flow through and kind of how was the process about getting into that more?
Yeah, so that's a really good and hard question. So I think specifically, we had been pivoting prior to COVID constantly. I mean, that's the beauty of starting any business. You're embracing change, you're listening to what your customers want, and ultimately they dictate where kind of your business goes. And so change for us was never rare. We were a really good, we've always been a very good team at embracing what's in the moment, what's working, what's not, doubling down on the things that do work, and then changing some of the things that don't work. And ultimately, we did that through the voice of our customers. So we were high touch feedback loop, right? And ultimately, the biggest pivot that we've seen is due to COVID. Obviously, creating an experience from in-person to virtual was different for us, right? We needed to create a new type of platform, a new type of experience. And so I think that mindset is fundamental for everybody. Understanding that, hey, like we're not coming into the office every single day. We weren't probably originally driven by the virtual experiences because we were all very in-person type people. Like we like to see people, we like to see people smile. Definitely. That's like part of our talent, right? And so I think that shift in and of itself was the mindset of like, hey, we have to ultimately do what is best for the business. And sometimes it makes it really hard as a founder. Both myself and my business partner found out that we ultimately were not the best true leaders to take on this next journey. And so a part of it was actually hiring people that we felt were as passionate about this virtually. And that's a really hard thing. So we ended up hiring people to really lead this next chapter, and they've been running a majority of the business, and we've really been almost like advisors supporting them. And it'll be interesting to see where the ship sails a little bit, but that was the best thing to do for the business and ultimately the best thing to do for our customers because we needed the best leaders in this next chapter. So
yeah, no, that's awesome. I mean, I think that decision of even going past the pivot of realizing, that's like another discussion, but also realizing when the skill sets, if you need to bring somebody in, that's also something really important for especially entrepreneurs to kind of get together and understand and fill in the gaps. So that's awesome. I guess, the last thing I actually wanted to figure out is, just to make sure that everybody talks about that individual pivot piece, because I think it's so important. What I'm hearing right now is there's regulations, then there's also, let's say COVID-19, there's something that no one is expecting. Maybe to hear a little bit about you, Matt, about more transactional. So I'm thinking it's a little bit more of the finance or more of the growth.
Yeah, exactly. So we were building a two-sided marketplace for our product. We had to both gather an audience of college students and get brands that wanted to market to them. And what we figured out was, the core piece of technology that we had was, or like our main value add was we were able to capture an individual's attention for around 2 minutes at a time, which in this day and age with everyone's mobile mindset is an absolute eternity. So kind of took those learnings from all the experimentation that we'd been doing up to that point, and decided that instead of trying to build an audience of college students, let's rely on the brand's market themselves. So not every brand is trying to target college students specifically. So we decided ultimately, let's just rely on whatever audience they have or that they're trying to get to, and create the best experiences that we can, which really allowed us to focus in on the core piece of value of the business.
So let me give you a quick follow-up. How has that worked out? And when you say core value of the business, maybe you could go into a little bit more, and where from going the transactional model to now having more of the model of working with the brands, what does that look like?
So I guess, when you're a startup, you're really strapped for resources. You're trying to do way too many things. You're running a lot of experiments. You're trying to kind of figure out what your DNA is, what your identity is. And at the end of the day, we figured out that we were much better at, building experiences that could retain attention than we were at getting street teams of college students on campuses to get individuals to sign up for this service. So we took a long, hard look at ourselves in the mirror and just figured it was going to be just a lot more scalable to just work with the brands.
Definitely. And I think what's interesting is that I hear that there's more of the growth, there's the regulations, as I mentioned, and then also the COVID-19 of something happening. But then I'd love to get into a little bit more is that, where are you currently in the company, and where is everybody currently in the company with that pivot happenings? Maybe starting out with you, Rithi, because I think what's pretty interesting, what I see similarities even between kind of the pivot that we went into in our company, Food Space, which I can talk to a little bit about a little bit later, but figuring out that the first product you created, it is the dream, or it's something that you wanted, but in the meantime, maybe working with something with less barriers to then prove out the model, or as you're proving out the model, doing it, but just taking the time to have that growth and having those opportunities where you can capture value along the way. Can you go into a little bit more of the logic that how that thought pattern was created, but also tell me a little bit about the dream to eventually have that medical device product?
Yeah, so I think we don't really think of pivoting as abandon one thing and just focus on something completely different, especially because the device is a platform technology. It has a lot of applications. So one of the initial things we struggled with actually was trying to figure out what's the right first application to chase after. Nice. And I think even within so we decided okay, we're going to focus on the things that require FDA regulation. A little bit down the line, we're going to go into the consumer space. But even within consumer, for a long time, we were first focused on thinking about looking at something like hair loss. And then we eventually transitioned into coming to consumer skincare. And that was very much informed by how we thought the product would be perceived by consumers in the market, what people look for when they buy consumer products. I think the kind of criteria that you write is completely different based on the kind of consumer sector that you go into. But I think the nice thing is that in our case, at least, because we initially started this with a lot of roots in the medical and biotech space, we have a lot of collaborators that work with us. So it's not like we had to put all of this other stuff aside. So we decided that right now we're 3 weeks away from launching our product. But at the same time, we have collaborators in academic institutions that are working with us on all of the academic pieces. We still have NIH grant money that's helping us push the work forward on the wound healing and on the EB front. And I wouldn't view it as it's slowed down just because the FDA process takes a long time for you to go from step A to the point where you can have an approved product. It's more just that this is giving us the opportunity to enter a super exciting market, and also to put the device into people's hands and tease out where we might need to make changes before going into the much more regulated environment where you have to think about things like sterility and how you're going to handle a combination device and all of that stuff.
Definitely. And just to kind of give you a quick follow-up on that piece, I think it's pretty interesting where there's that mix of that you're not giving up, you're not completely leaving the idea or leaving it behind. You're kind of just working towards capturing pieces of the market and still having the lessons learned or learning lessons in order to create the rest. But one piece that I've always curious about to hear from, especially the entrepreneurs community, is that how do you make sure that you're spending enough time on the first product or the pivot, but also giving enough kind of like maybe like 20%, 10% of the effort to know that in the future, this is something that we're working on? How do you kind of balance those two pieces of needing to focus on one piece to have it be successful, but at the same time, having a goal of other avenues that you can get into?
I mean, I think oh, go ahead.
No.
No,
I was just going to say, like, I think for us, at least, it was really just that we put our immediate team on like what we're launching in the near term. And then we've been working with our collaborators and like giving people devices or like working with them and kind of handing that piece over to someone that can work with us to help us push the other stuff, so that we're not putting our day-to-day effort in doing it, but at the same time, we're still very involved in being able to get it done.
Okay. And then Michelle, I think you wanted to.
I was just going to say, it's really, I think, a balance between empowering your team, right? And allowing them to take reins and giving them confidence and boosting their morale to say, hey, like, you can do this, right? And you can own this for me while I'm over here kind of working on, you know, the next iteration or the next part of the focus, or, you know, something that we have out of the blue. And providing that, and that's one of the things that when you're looking to hire, you're looking for someone that wears multiple hats, that can take and isn't afraid to step in and be that leader when, you know, you may not be able to be there as much. So I think it's really important that you leverage your team, and that's why it's so important, even in the early stages to the later stages, like who you hire and why every single hire matters, because you're going to need to lean on them with confidence.
Yeah, and I think I kind of went into a little bit, but hearing you just say that, kind of going into a little bit more of it, how do you prepare your team to pivot where there will be those changes? Maybe somebody was your direct report, or maybe somebody was working with you and now you're working on another project. Is it that you maybe prepare them over time? Do you let them know the reasons? Kind of what's the process that you've seen, Michelle, that you've had it where it's been a successful pivot, especially during COVID?
I think that transparency is really key, right? Like for our team, everyone always knew like what our KPIs were. I mean, there were no secrets, right? We would even share a P&L so that they were bought in by the same reasons. It's like, this is why we need to hit these goals and these metrics, right? And if they become part of the solution and they become part of the message, I think that you'll find greater success in getting them to embody like what you're looking to accomplish.
Definitely.
And a lot of them always give really good perspective. So things that sometimes you're so in the business, right? Like if you're totally just managing the P&L, and you know, if you're, you know, raising money in capital, which is sometimes an ongoing project, they're sometimes have such a different perspective because they're looking at the business in a different way, and they're not in the business the same way that you are, but they understand it enough to give perspective. So I think it's a balance of that, right? It's giving them enough to feel like they're part of the vision, the solution, the goal, and empowering them to understand that like they play a big role in the journey, right? It's not me, it's not Brian, it's not the co-founders, it's the team. It's we, right? So
definitely. And maybe one thing would be wonderful is maybe starting with Matt and Rithi, then Michelle, you guys can just go about telling us a little bit how many people are on your team, just so that everyone can kind of get a sense of, I guess, the conversations that you're having in terms of the pivots. Yeah.
We're about 40 at the moment. But when this was going on, it was a little bit closer to 10. It was like real early days, probably about 5 years ago at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, we started with obviously a 3, then we went up to a 10 like crew like on the team, and then we scaled back a little bit again. So it's a fluctuating thing, just depending on where we're headed and what resources we need.
Awesome.
We're a team of about 15 right now.
Nice.
And I think like at this time last year, we were a team of like 4. So I think we're like very much in the growing fast phase.
Nice. Nice. And I guess kind of one thing that I'd love to hear from everyone is that what was the lessons kind of learned from pivoting? Are you excited about, are you excited about the process? I think maybe starting with Matt, since it was more of the figuring out how to grow, how to scale that piece, how to get into more hands of your market and your consumers. Maybe you could let us know a little bit about the lessons that you had from that piece, like maybe one hardship and then on the other side, kind of the success.
Yeah, so I think Michelle kind of covered it a little bit when she was talking about how, building a business is a constant set of, it's always a changing environment, and you're making like these little micro pivots all throughout, where you're talking to customers, you're learning what they like, what they don't like, and then you have to, cater to what they need, what they're asking for.
Mhm.
So I think one thing that we really did well when we pivoted was we changed up the pitch, from kind of a fancy survey tool to something a little bit more aspirational. If you could have a conversation with every one of your consumers individually, what are the top 5 questions you would ask them? What are the top 5 most important pieces of data that you would like to know about them? And taking this approach, it really caught the eye of the executives of some of these really large brands, and that was our foot in the door. Where this actually was a bit of a drawback was kind of mapping out the path to that end goal. So when it came time to actually get into the weeds with the clients who would actually be using the product, it was a little less clear as to what they would be doing. So that was something that we had to learn on the fly, and eventually we really fleshed out like the full picture.
Mhm. That's awesome. So I'm hearing about really it's figuring out the piece, pivoting, being able to get that feedback, being able to understand what the change was. And then also, there might be difficulties in putting it all together, but just knowing that there is a reason why the pivot was happening and there is a reason why like that growth could be had. It's now about just really getting all the ducks in order to have that process be as successful as possible.
Yeah, and it's scary. Like you're basically saying we're gonna completely abandon this one path, this one revenue model, this one code base, whatever it is, and going after something new. It's maybe not quite as wild as starting a business from scratch, but it's anxiety inducing.
Definitely is. And I think I just wanted to say one thing about it is that just hearing your story a little bit about our company, Food Space, that just did our pivot about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, it's pretty interesting to see where we started off being a consumer platform where we were helping people eat well, shop well, where now we're more of a company with B2B software that we're helping individuals understand product information, giving information to Walmart, Nestle, being able to capture correct digital data. And it went from having an app to using computer vision and AI to capture product information from, let's say, a package. And the one thing I can say about that is that not that since there is a large change to those pieces, I definitely did learn a lot in the first instant to give me the idea to say that, oh, this might be a bigger problem. So I'm wondering if anybody on the call, just kind of like one of the questions that I had is, was did one of the pivots also happen where you realized that I thought this was the issue, but I realized that the issue was much bigger than I was currently kind of factoring in. So that's why the pivot had to come about. Is that what anybody has seen in their businesses personally, or not so much?
Yeah, I think that sometimes you start a business because you experienced a pain, right? Or
Yeah.
your friend experienced a pain, right? And you do enough research and you're like, hey, like this is a gold mine, right? And you don't really realize what you're getting into until you're in it,
Yeah.
know? And so as you're in it, you start to realize like, wow, like I thought this was either far larger or I'm approaching kind of it in the wrong way. I see that the opportunity is far larger in a different sense. And so I think what we found was more of the way that we approached it was limiting us to be able to be everything that we wanted to be.
Definitely.
And so we needed to think about the business differently in order to capture what our ultimate goal was, right? And so sometimes we had to work a little backwards, right? Like what's our 5-year plan? And then let's scale that backwards. And where are we today to get there? And we made decisions today to ultimately and had to change a lot of our approach in order to hit that. And we looked at the business backwards a little bit. And that's what ultimately helped us look at the larger picture. But sometimes you're just so excited because you felt this pain and you want to address something and you're naive. And that's the beauty of it. It's like, you don't know what it's like to start a business and what it's going to take and what the process is. But that's kind of what also makes it exciting.
Definitely. I think that's like the piece, like, you know, the lessons learned, being able to take that understanding and not just say, oh man, like, oh, I guess I gotta figure something out, but really being able to use your resources around you to make sure that you can really apply those resources to either your new business, your new pivot, your new kind of operation that you're going about doing, and doing that efficiently. So maybe I guess I think to hear from you the last time also, Rathi, is just to talk about the one lesson you learned from pivoting, like moving from still of course in the same space, but moving to understanding that maybe it's important to focus on this piece first, and then as we're focusing on it, broaden out. So maybe a couple of lessons that you've gotten from that in terms of like managing, growing, and seeing how that went about having.
Yeah, I mean, I think it touches upon a couple of the other panelists mentioned. I think it's like you have to hire the right team for the right things. And building a consumer skincare company is very different, even if you're like talking about skin, than it is to build say a hardcore like biotech business, because the business plan is just completely different. I think like recognizing how different, what the needs of your business are is very important. I think the other thing we've learned is that, you know, given that like our team initially came from like technical backgrounds and all of the people we work with are like in the medical sphere and like doctors and all of that stuff, jumping into like a direct to consumer retail immediately wasn't like, it wouldn't have, we are going to eventually sell direct to consumer, but part of our strategy was to eventually get the buy-in of dermatologists and doctors to actually recommend the product and to maintain credibility in like, the medical world, so that when we, do start selling direct to consumer, it's not as though this product gets lost in the noise of all of the other products that are out there. And I think thinking through some of that strategy was really important, because really like thinking about medicine is really different than thinking about consumer, but there are areas where they intersect with each other. And with the right team and like having the right business plan, I think you can accomplish it pretty well.
Awesome. So I think, I guess the one other question, this is kind of something that even I've questioned myself and kind of questioned in terms of the pivot. What I'm curious about is were there any real operational or very intense operational changes that had to happen in the business when you went about pivoting? And also maybe were there other opportunities or other changes in terms of maybe an individual that was one of your staff members had to change roles, had to change the way that they're thinking about it. You had to kind of coach people in order to help them with the pivot. Because one thing that I've always seen is that when there's a pivot, somebody that you hired as this role that focused on that half or that piece of the company, they were amazing at that like structure of it. But then when the pivot happened, it kind of happened where that individual or that opportunity or that operation wasn't able to be as successful because it was for a different application. So is there anybody that has a story of where a specific piece of their business kind of had to maybe change, or just maybe you had to coach the individual or staff member on how to take in this new role and be successful in it, in your pivot? And I can give a quick example of that, what I mean of that piece. But for example, for us, it was more of, we had been focusing on consumer platform and having individuals that helped us with, let's say, the social media aspect, like our marketers, and working on those platforms. We're moving to more B2B. We're now changing over to more sales. What we had to do in our company is really kind of help our team members to now understand that you won't be using as much of the social media aspect to get new clients. It's going to be more of the organization, the email, the outbound marketing. And it was pretty difficult to kind of get that skill set, but luckily we were able to kind of arrange ourselves and have team members that really wanted to figure out new skill sets to be able to be successful at that. So I was just curious, is there anybody that had like kind of a challenge like similar to that in your operations?
I can take this one.
Yeah.
So when we made our pivot, like I said, we were giving this very aspirational pitch, and we kind of had to figure out what the steps were to actually get there were. So the way that we first accomplished this was to basically create a white glove service where we would be taking care of the nitty gritty details of the implementations, these essentially surveys where we'd be doing all of the creative. We would do, we'd be kind of like crafting the questions themselves, working very closely with our clients to help deploy them. And it very quickly became unmanageable. We had a very large customer success team, with a small army of interns at any given point in the year, to make it all happen. And what we had to do was basically make our product more and more self-service. So really take some very complicated things and make them simple. And that's a very difficult thing to do, especially when you're given a new piece of software that you've never used before. Figuring out where all the knobs are, how you do certain things in the platform, where you get the data from, can be incredibly difficult. So that was a very long learning experience when we actually did pivot.
Definitely. And I'm not sure, Michelle, if you wanted to mention anything or kind of about your experience on that. If you had an example, but if not, it's fine. No, don't want to call you out.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's probably multiple examples, right? When you kind of are calling someone up to play the role. I guess in this example, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but we tap someone on the shoulder, having them really run the business for us in a lot of ways, because her mindset was it was where it needed to be, right? And she was embracing this next chapter, right? And like I said, it's never an easy thing to say, hey, like we started this and we're not the best leaders for this next chapter. But again, ultimately, it was just the best decision for the business, and we made the decision, and it's the best decision we've made so far. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. And I think one thing I want to do is I'll get back to one more question on the pivot, but one thing I wanted to ask y'all is just currently right now in the last month, is there a cool project that you've worked on in the company that maybe you would like to tell, I guess, the people on the phone call a little bit about, just to tell them a kind of what success is coming out, what is the traction, what's a milestone, just kind of one factor that you're pretty excited that's coming out or has come out in the last month or so. So I know that, for example, I know that you mentioned that you're launching your new product, Rathi, maybe this month or this next week. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about like your excitement and kind of what's happening with that piece.
Yeah, it's really cool to go from like just building like 50 units in like your office to like actually translating it to a manufacturing site and like building like hundreds of units. And like in our case, there's a consumable component that goes into the device. So it's like 100,000 of those. So it's a lot of moving parts all at once. And like, we're still a pretty small team. So it's kind of all hands on deck, but it's also super exciting because like we've finally been able to give the device to people and put it in consumers' hands and get feedback on it. And I guess like it feels really real. And like, we're getting close to the stage where like our website will go live pretty soon. Nice. And we're just really pumped to launch soon.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah. I guess, does anybody else want to kind of go through maybe something that's been interesting? I mean, it's been COVID-19, guys. Maybe something's changed a little bit in the operations, or maybe not seeing your coworkers for a little while, like how to managing that, something that's along those lines.
Yeah, we did something very interesting, which I don't think you asked directly, but I think is a different story for sure. So we actually raised our first round we had raised our first round a while ago, and so I'm kind of talking in the chronological order of everything. So we had raised our first round, which was super exciting because we really took our time. We didn't need the business. We didn't need the money to keep the lights on. We needed it to, again, work backwards on some of those goals, right? And so it was super exciting, a great journey for myself. I met some incredible people in Boston, and ultimately felt so great about every single person that we ended up extending hey, we're inviting you to participate in this round. And what ended up happening was all of them were just incredible. And when COVID hit, we almost felt like we owed it to them in a sense. Like, hey, they believed in us, they believe in us, and like we can't really tell them what our next chapter of our business is going to be because all we do are in-person events, right? And for whatever reason, I knew that this was going to be, and I kept saying to my investors, like, this is going to be 2 years. Like, it's not 1 week, 3 months. And they're like, it's going to be fine, Michelle. Like, you're overreacting. Like, do not worry. And I was like, no, like, we cannot do what we used to do. And we're not going to be able to promise you the things that we thought we were, right? And I just had so much respect for a lot of them. We ended up deciding to give all of our investors their money back.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of them actually didn't want their money back. And so they wanted, and we ultimately wanted to keep the brand alive. We wanted to keep us afloat through this entire experience. But we didn't really, we wanted the pressure of the investors, but we didn't want the pressure of the investors in an environment that was so uncertain. And we thought, okay, if we have the cash, we're just going to burn through it. And we were such a nimble team. Like, we were so scrappy, like the scrappiest ways of being scrappy, we found them. And so what we did was we found a way to be operational with just hitting our operational costs, finding ways to make money in order to just kind of offset our costs till we would ride this wave. And so I think it was like one of the hardest but most developing moments for myself, like even in my whole professional career, was being able to do that, like giving back that money that we worked so hard to raise, and just, you know, in the flash of like the matter of 2 weeks, giving all of that back. So we knew that, like, hey, this isn't the end of Host. We want to keep the brand alive. And ultimately now today, it's the best decision we've made. And we still stand really great with all our investors. They still want to invest in us. But we made the right decisions for the business at the time. We continue to do that. And ultimately, we're 4 times more profitable this month than we were last year this month. So it really honestly all worked out.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I guess kind of the one last point that I'll make is that's pretty interesting to say that, because I would say that in terms of our pivot, being that we were originally a consumer app, and then we kind of more focused in the digital space of correcting information from like Walmart, Target, all those individuals to have accurate information. Now that people were shopping more online, it's kind of there's kind of like that double-edged piece where, because people were shopping more online, there was more of a focus on our business and our points, so it kind of accelerated our process. But that's like what's so interesting about like hearing all across the industry, the different experiences that COVID-19 has really had, the terrible effects of that it's had in terms of the community, but also the effects on the business and kind of how people have figured out how to pivot, how to change their business. If you're focusing more of like day-to-day activities with people and meeting them, how do you focus and move that to more of the digital space? And I think that's what's wonderful about the entrepreneur sector, being able to have that in a way that you can really flip it up and still have a manageable business, and making those decisions not only for your team, but also for your investors, like you said, Michelle. So that's awesome to hear. So I guess like to the one last thing that I wanted to hear from Matt is that you mentioned that your pivot was about 5 years ago. And I know that I've been pressing everybody on this, or 4 years ago. Can we know a little bit more details in terms of the pivot happened? You were earlier stage about 4 years ago, but right now, what does the trajectory look like? And that pivot, how many brands did it go from before the pivot, or how many relationships to now after the pivot that you're working with now?
Yeah, so our transition happened pretty quickly, and we basically decided to break up with most of our legacy clients when that happened.
Okay.
So to just kind of like cut the head off the snake, so to speak, to just, you know, get a clean start. And it took a good 6 months before we really started to have meaningful revenue after that, and it was a stressful time. But since then we're doing that march towards profitability. We've really figured out a much more sustainable, scalable sales model, and we're starting to make a lot more strategic partnerships with certain companies where we can kind of add some additional on ramps into our software to just make it easier for new brands to sign up, with slightly fewer features, but at a much lower price point, and really get our software out there as a leader in the marketing space.
Okay, awesome. So I think for the last couple minutes that we have, there's a couple questions that are here, but someone said, thank you panelists. Of course, thank everyone for being here, but could you each share your experience working with investors if you raised money before your pivot or raising money after the pivot? If anybody wants to take that question. And if it's less about the raising of the money, we can just change that more of like even just working with maybe advisors, maybe working with people that had that vested interest with you before and after the pivot. Were they more excited? Were they did they help you lead into that discussion? Kind of hearing a little bit about if you have any of those experiences.
I mean, I can take it. Ultimately, if someone, whether it be an angel or VC, like whoever you choose, if they're ultimately investing in you, they're in with you for the ride, right? And most of the angels in Boston, I think that Boston has a great angel selection. They understand the risks associated to it, right? Like they're not giving you money that they're using to buy their milk and their eggs, right? Like this is money that they've set aside, understanding that, hey, like they have to think of it almost as, in a sense, like gambling, like it could be gone, right? But they want to help their odds, right? And so they typically want to see you succeed through highs and lows. And some of them like to bet on the founder. Some of them look for other things like specific metrics. Some like to invest at later stages, right? So it all has to do with the type of whether it be angel or VC, and understanding what their intentions are and what they want out of it. I found asking those questions up front allowed me to help choose the best fit for complementing the team that we had and then the vision that we had, right? I had some investors that I knew were going to absolutely help me push the envelope. I had other investors that were, that had an incredible network. I had other investors that I knew were going to help break us into certain accounts, right? And so all investors are going to be different and they're going to help you in different ways. And so I think it's really important that you have a little bit of a mix and you identify prior to raising or even looking for an advisor, ultimately what you're looking for, and not just take anybody on for that journey, but really do your homework and meet with, I had 167 coffees, right? And then I went back and I selected 10 to 13 that I was interested in working with. And I was like, hey, I'm interested in having you be part of this journey with me and helping me develop, grow, see the business through. So it really depends on like what you're looking for and who.
Definitely. And I think one question came in, we kind of started off at the beginning of the question where we talked about, if you want to get into this a little bit more, if we didn't really hear your story about this, but the signs of needing a pivot was a resistance from customers and investors or other stakeholders. But what I wanted to get into more of is, were there other options of where to pivot? Because I think that's a pretty cool question where you might see an opportunity to pivot, but you might see an opportunity to pivot in 5 different directions. How did you work with your team? Did you figure out maybe with your advisors, with your mentors, with maybe there was a leading path or like a way that you could figure it out? But if there were more than one options of where you could go, how did you get to that one option? What were some of the kind of steps you had to take to really drill down and figure that out? If anybody wants to kind of go on that
I mean,
or talk a little.
I think part of it is figuring out like what problem you're trying to solve. Because I think a lot of times it's easy to fall into the trap of being like, I've created a solution, now let me find the right problem for this. And I think instead the right way to approach it is to think about what's the problem people have, and then to be like, let's here's something I've created and let me engineer it further to make sure it really addresses their solution. So I think for us, at least, like, we very much wanted to make sure we were solving a real problem and like a real pain point that people had. And that especially as a platform technology, it's easy to be like, here's something that I can apply to literally anything I can think of. Which one should I do first? But I think instead we wanted to go after the, what's the thing that's like best for us to develop and also solves a real problem in like in consumers' lives.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And that's good to, I think that's what's pretty interesting, where if you really understand the need or the problem that your consumer, your business, someone that you're working with in the space, if you really understand that problem, you're able to figure out that even though we're pivoting to this piece, it doesn't matter because this is a solution that can best help you in terms of speed, efficacy, let's say just in terms of growth, or being able to really capture that the value instantly. And that's what's pretty cool, where in our case, for example, where the pivot, where there were a lot of different options of us coming from consumer to more of the B2B space, but we just thought also it was kind of like a mix of what did we think would be the most help for, let's say, society, but also something that we also had the skill set in order to carve out a piece of that to make the most value for our customers. So that's kind of like how we thought about that back-to-back idea. But that's awesome to hear all the different stories about kind of the pivoting and how that's gone about happening.
Hey, just wanted to let you know we have about 10 minutes left in the session. So I think we have time for maybe one or two more good questions from the audience. And then we'll close it out.
Nice. Okay. So I think actually one question just came in from Sarah is, what if you're building something that hasn't been done before? Like if you're building something that hasn't been done before, so there isn't really like a proof point of what you're going about doing. If you guys have any like maybe advice for individuals that are doing that and you need to go to investors to get that capital, what's a way that you could probably go about showing them that this does have value? Maybe you're comparing it to something else. Maybe you're just comparing the end result if the solution isn't the same. Because as I see it, just thinking a little bit about kind of going back to you, Rithi, your project of your company of just really going about creating that consumer platform or consumer application. How do you prove that model out if perhaps there wasn't something that was relative in the industry that was already been created, or and if there has been something created, you are doing it a kind of different way. So how are you proving to individuals that it kind of will work out? Do you have to do tests before you even sell it? How's like the process of that?
I mean, like, I think like for us, the real appeal of it is that it hasn't really been done before, and that like a device like this doesn't exist, for example, right? And I think that's what makes it exciting for like a consumer to want to try it or use it. But I think, of course, there's like a lot of engineering hurdles that you have to solve to get there. And I think it's true across most startups. Like most of the time you are building something that somebody hasn't thought of or done before, it doesn't exist. And I think you do have to convince an investor that it's worth investing in and why they should believe in you. But I think ultimately, like if the market is there for it, and like if there are people, like basically if like you have a really solid team, a really solid market, and you have a good plan to get there, we found that like investors are much more receptive to that versus being like, here's a huge goal I have that I have no plan or I don't know who I'm gonna hire to do it.
Definitely.
But yeah, I think like the appeal of like working in a startup really is that like across the board, I'm sure everyone here, like you're really building something that somebody hasn't done before, and that's what makes it super exciting.
Yeah, and like from our experience, what we've seen is that when you first start off your startup, it's kind of like your investors are investing in you, not so much the company. They want that person that's, probably a lot of y'all have seen this, but there's probably been a lot of hard days. And that person that's able to take that hard day and really transform it into a day where they were successful, they learned something out of that. And I think that's really what I've seen personally in the beginning stages of working with your startup. And that kind of leads into the next question of, can you talk about starting your first business? Did you use pre-seed program or an accelerator, or maybe just like some friends and family angel around investing? Is that something that maybe somebody wants to touch upon as we kind of close out? Because I think that's pretty interesting for everybody to hear about the different ways in terms of financing, and also like some of the challenges it is of starting your first business.
So we went through like a few different events. It all kind of started with an event at Boston College where the whole founding team went to school, called BCVC, it's like BC Venture Capital Competition. And we came out of that with, I think it was like a $7,500 check. So that was just kind of a validation of an idea and a business plan. And then from there, I think we applied to Techstars 5 or 6 times before we finally got in February 2013. So there was a lot of that resilience there to like keep iterating on the business plan and keep applying and trying. And once we got into Techstars, we were really able to dedicate a ton of time and energy into building out the business.
Okay. And I think we might have one quick moment for like a real quick question, but maybe one thing that I was thinking about is in terms of just staying on the investor topic, what did you need to do in order to successfully communicate your pivot to your investors? I know, Michelle, you got into this a little bit more, just thinking about that piece of you had to be really communicative, you had to really tell individuals about what was going on and just make sure that your investors knew that they trusted like kind of your leadership. But is there any sort of documents, or maybe you had to send updates a little bit more to get them comfortable in a standpoint where they understood fully what was going on, but then also understood maybe ways that they can use their expertise to help you through the process? If anybody wants to touch up on that in the last like 3 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I can take that. We ultimately spoke to each one of them individually instead of as a group at first. And so I got on the phone with every single one of them, and I just shared with them what I was thinking, what we were thinking, how we were feeling, getting their input. A lot of them at the time were like, hey, I've managed a business in 2008, but this is not like 2008, right? And so a lot of them would say like, I don't even have the right advice to give, but what I can give is like my experience through something that might have been challenging, right? And every perspective was so different. I think ultimately, it's great to bounce ideas off of them, but they're going to support you in pretty much anything that you do. Now, that being said, there are some investors that I've heard of that, your total 180 your business, and they're like, yeah, it's not really what I signed up for, so I'm not too jazzed about it. But right, again, that's my selection in who I put my money in, trust in, right? So I think that ultimately they will support you in the pivot. We didn't really provide total documentation of like what the whole pivot was going to look like, but that was really because we were giving their money back, right? So it would have probably been different should we not have been doing that. And so ultimately for us, it didn't make much sense providing that documentation.
Okay. Nice.
Well, great. Thank you so much to everyone in this panel. It's really been a pleasure to have you all.